Hello everyone for Foundational JavaScript. I'm Gray Lewis. I am so excited to be teaching this course for Eduonix because I love JavaScript. I think it is a syntactically beautiful language that feels great to write, and it's a super versatile, effective, and powerful language for any developer looking to get started with building web apps. So what exactly is JavaScript? Well, for one, it is the most popular programming language right now. Used by professional developers, but also in terms of all people, even hobbyists. And that's because it is the language of the web, the most versatile platform that we have access to as developers. And JavaScript is built to what is known as the ECMAScript specification. ECMA is a European standards organization, and they publish a general purpose programming language specification called ECMAScript. And they update it regularly with new features, new syntactic sugar, and what have you. And JavaScript is built to that specification. And this is basically to ensure that all browsers run JavaScript the same way. And it is also a just-in-time compiled language. Now, for one, this provides performance advantages, but it also gives a really great developer experience because we're going to be able to run the code directly from JS into our runtime rather than having to compile it, such as if we were writing an Android application. And JavaScript is also multi-paradigm. This means that we can use object-oriented programming styles, we can use functional programming styles, etc. And this is great. So it's general purpose. We can write the code however we want to, whatever is the most effective. That's the key. Whatever is the most effective way to write the code that we're using for a given project, we can do that. And it's also, especially as of recently, not just being used in the web browser itself. It's also being used to build web servers on the back end. And this is really fantastic. It gives us a lot of flexibility when it comes to building projects, right? We can build the front end and the back end in the exact same language, even using the same libraries, and it's going to just greatly speed up how fast we can get to production on a project. So as you can see, JavaScript is a really fantastic language with a bunch of things going for it. And I'm really excited to start teaching you guys a little bit about what makes JavaScript so great, going more into detail about how we can actually build projects using JavaScript. And yeah, so thanks for watching this first video. I'll see you guys in the next video, which is about the different ways we can run JavaScript, as well as what JavaScript runtime we'll be using for the course. HTML allows you to sort of outline a hierarchical structure of documents, which are going to represent, text, images, the basic data that's going to make up your web page. And then CSS is going to allow us to style that. So I want to start by just explaining the very basics of how to make an HTML page. So you can just write some bare bones HTML without any CSS, and you can watch it render. So the basic structure of a HTML page is going to start like this. You're going to have your head here and your body here. And as you can see, there's these tags which are going to surround other elements. So HTML here is the parent element, we would call it, and it has two children, the head element and the body element. And you'll see that there's an opening tag and a closing tag, and those are going to let us know anything inside these two tags is inside of this element. Pretty simple stuff. The head is going to be where you link other resources, so the CSS maybe, or some web font that you want to use on your website, just anything other than the things that we're going to be adding inside the content, the body of the website, right? So here we have the body. If I go ahead and make a div, I can add some text to that div, hello world, and then we can go ahead and refresh the document, and we will see that indeed we have updated the content of the page. And now one more absolutely essential thing to understand about working with CSS and HTML is that each element doesn't really have a way to address it individually. We don't have a name yet for this element. And so we can give it a name simply by giving it what is called an attribute. So I've added a space here. I've added the attribute name equals, and then I'm going to, inside of quotation marks, add a class name. And you can even add multiple class names. And today we're going to be designing a little bit of just like a navigation bar, just like at the top where you have the links. Just something super simple so that we can get an idea for how these things work on a very basic level. So I'll go ahead and name this navigation container. And now we've given it a name. That won't really affect the actual contents of the page yet, but we'll see how we can do that right now. So inside of the head, we're going to open a style element. And what this is going to tell the document is that anything inside of these two tags is actually CSS. It's going to treat it as if it's CSS. So CSS has a different syntax entirely. We're going to go dot navigation container, and then we're going to have a set of brackets. And now we know that we're addressing this element because obviously the name is the same, and this dot here means that we're addressing it on a class. So class navigation container, class navigation container. You can also use what's called an ID, and then you would do it like with a hashtag instead of a dot. However, it is best practices to use a class. So we're going to go ahead and just start by using a class. And then inside of these brackets here, we can start declaring different styles that we want to apply. So I could go width 100%, text align center. And then if we go ahead here and refresh the page, we can see that it has indeed centered. And I want to show you one more thing now. This is going to be a huge, important tool for you to know how to use in web development, and that is the inspect element tool. So if you go to inspect, right click anywhere on a page and click inspect, you can actually see the CSS, HTML, and what have you that make up the site that we're looking at. And this is super useful for debugging your own code. So we can see here, navigation container, we see the width, and if we hover over it, we can even see the box that is encapsulating this content. So we can tell that the width did indeed change, even though the text isn't spanning that. So now I want to do just some very basic styling here. I'm going to be adding this little code here just to get rid of some of the default styles that HTML adds to the page. And additionally, I'm going to go ahead and add a few more styles here in terms of adding a background color and a height. There we go. And you really don't have to get into the nitty-gritty of what these different styles mean at the moment. You really are going to have to get good at Googling, like, okay, I want to change the color of this. Google that question and figure out what the corresponding CSS style is. So background color, we've set it to this. Height, we've given it a specified height, etc. So now we see that we indeed have this element with that background color, and we're well on our way to building this. So instead of adding some text inside here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add a couple more elements, and I've pre-written that here for us. I'm going to break this down for you really quickly. So first we have a div called home link, and as you can see, we've actually added a second class here, link. So we could address this div by either of these names, and importantly, we can actually address all of these divs, which are supposed to look the same, right, by using the same class. So if I were to go here and do .link, we can now start to style, actually style these elements by doing something like that. So we've added a font and a specified font size and boldness and a width and a line height and a height. And again, don't worry too much about the particulars of this. I'm just kind of trying to show you the very basics. And then inside of this element here, we have an A element, which isn't necessarily self-explanatory, but it is a link. So what this means is that, and here I'll quickly, we'll look at the updated content here. We haven't quite fixed the positioning of these elements, but you can see that now these are links. And if I click them, it'll take me to a page that doesn't exist. And we define where these links go to by the href attribute. And because it's inside of that div, this text will be will be a link inside of this container div, is what we would call it. It's a container. These div elements are actually dummy elements. So they essentially, they aren't opinionated in any way. There's nothing special about a div. It is just a dummy element for you to apply whatever styles you want to it, unlike the A element, which has a specified purpose and a specified functionality. So now I'm going to be taking you to something a little more advanced in CSS, something that is extremely powerful. This is called a flexbox. And all you have to do to make a element into a flexbox is add display flex. And now we have a bunch of powerful positioning tools. For one, it's going to go ahead and fix this problem here and organize them cleanly into a row. And we can also justify the content to the center. And as you can see, it's done that for us. So one last thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go ahead and give this color white because that blue is a little ugly. And you can see that now that we've adjusted the A, and I have no dot here because instead of addressing a class, I'm now addressing any A element, any element with that is with the name A. As you can see here, it is the type of element. And by not using a dot beforehand, CSS knows that we're talking about the element rather than the class name applied to that element. All right, so I've just taken you through a crash course of the absolute basics of how CSS and HTML come together to structure a web page. Don't get too worried if this is confusing. Just try to remember the key aspects. This is hierarchical structured documents. How do classes work? That's going to be key. And, just understand that CSS is separate from HTML and that you can use it to apply styles. And you can sort of work it out as you go. I think the number one skill that you're going to need to learn as a web developer is to be able to be flexible, right? Understand that you're not going to actually have the knowledge all the time, and you're always going to be reaching out to Google to try to figure out how to do things. And as you do that more and more, you'll have to Google less and less. But you still will have to Google quite a lot. That's a huge part of the job. So one of the things that makes JavaScript such a popular language at the moment is the ability for it to be used on computers and on browsers. That is to say, on the server side and on the client side. And that's extremely powerful because that means that we can build the logic for the databases and user authentication and such in the same language that we can build the front end. And that's a super exciting idea. And so to be able to run code on the back end, we need to actually have a runtime that's going to allow us to, use JavaScript as if it were a different language, sort of like Python, right? Where we can execute code, maybe even interact with the operating system that code is running on, and etc. And Node provides us with all of that. And it also provides us with a super useful tool, Node Package Manager. And what Node Package Manager does is allow us to install and manage dependencies to be able to build our website. And this, for example, is Express. It's an extremely popular module which allows us to use JavaScript to create web servers. So we can actually listen for requests coming in over the internet and send appropriate requests back. And so you can see how this is useful. We're able to, speed up the development time by using other people's code, bring in modules, and get functionality all really easily using NPM. And we'll cover a bit more on that later. So as I said, the reason that JavaScript is becoming so popular as a development skill is that it's able to be used on the front end and the back end effectively. And so I want to give a little demonstration now about how how to run code in the browser. And simultaneously, how that code can then be run on the computer. So we have a blank index.html document here. One really useful tip that I'm going to give you now is if you just type in an exclamation point and press enter, it will actually give you all the boilerplate for a basic HTML document. This is obviously if you're working with VS Code. And that's really helpful. It allows us to skip a little bit of work that we would have to do otherwise. So in order to create JavaScript on a web page, there's actually two approaches. We can either do what's called an inline approach to writing JavaScript, or we can create an external file, which this index.html will actually import and run the JavaScript from. And I'll show you both right now. So as I showed you in the HTML video, we just basically create an opening and closing tag similar to what we would do for CSS styles if we wanted to use inline CSS. And then we can just start writing JavaScript here, and our browser will know that because it's in a script tag, it should be executed as JavaScript. So I'm going to give a quick little hello world demonstration. And one other really useful tip is to use live server. I actually it's a extension on the on VS Code, and what it will allow you to do is live refresh whenever you make changes in your code and not have to handle opening it. And obviously, as your website gets more complex, it's a little more than just dragging and dropping an index.html file onto the browser. So I recommend using the live reload extension, which I will include somewhere as a link. So now if we go into the console, we can actually see that we have the hello world. It printed to the console, and yeah, so it ran. So now the other approach is actually to use an external file, and we're going to do that using a script tag with a source attribute, which points to a file that I've already created, script.js, in the same folder. And then in this file, first of all, I'm going to go ahead and change hello world to inline code. Then I'm going to go ahead and go into the script here, and I'm going to do external code. And then if we refresh, we'll see that we have the inline code and the external code both printing. They are both valid. I would say that as you have a more complex JavaScript code base, obviously it's going to make a lot more sense to use external files rather than keeping everything in the same file, which gets a little bit messy. But either is valid and works essentially the same. So yeah, that's obviously, as you can see, it's really easy to use JavaScript inside of a website, inside of an HTML file, and to run the code. It's very straightforward. But what makes it so powerful, as I've touched on a couple times now, is we can actually run the exact same code. This isn't always the case, as there are some features that only exist on the browser and some features that only exist when running through Node. But in this case, we can actually use the exact same code, and it will do the same thing for us, at least with the external file. So I can't run an HTML file in Node, but what I can do is I can run that external file that we have here. I'm just going to do that by saying node script.js, and we'll see that it prints the same thing, external code, which is right here. The console.log functions exactly the same between the browser and my local machine. And this is extremely powerful. It minimizes the amount of time you're going to spend rewriting code if you need to move it between the back end and the front end. And it also eliminates a huge amount of time overhead in that, if you want to be a full stack engineer and you want to handle both the back end and the front end of an application, you only have to learn one language. And it also helps because, maybe you can carry over some libraries, some knowledge about libraries that you use from the back end to the front end and vice versa. So overall, an extremely powerful aspect of JavaScript. All right, thanks for watching video 2.